Okay, so good morning.
Morning, sir.
Please, can you introduce yourself so the people know who you are?
My name is Brian Tamuka Kagoro.
Okay.
I'm an African citizen, a Pan-Africanist, who lives across the continent.
What country are you from? What's your country of origin?
Aha, that's good. I was born in Zimbabwe, and I consider that to be my land of birth. But the reason why I said I'm from across the rest of the continent is I've lived and worked
in different places. So you have a wide idea of what happens in Africa.
The borders are colonial borders, so I refuse to be reduced. And my ancestors tell us that we migrated from somewhere beyond where we're settled. So I don't use settlement as the sole reason for identifying my Africanness.
Okay, now let's talk about elections and politics in Africa. We know in the last 1 month we had elections in Kenya and Rwanda and Kenya, and the elections went smoothly. What do you think that represents for African nations? Because we know that when it comes to Africa, it's really marred with violence, but we didn't see any of that in this last elections. What do you think that represents for Africa?
I think that elections represent an interesting contradiction for Africa. So whilst there are some that went smoothly in terms of there not being violence, there were substantial things that may have happened. Within the Kenyan election, we know that they are in court disputing certain things. But I think there's something that we should celebrate, that the ability to administer elections has substantially improved from the jungle days of the 1990s. However, the complexity of using technology has brought with it the capacity of a single hacker, the capacity of technically astute folk being able to substitute the will of the masses. But it has also made the usual suspicions that are attended to elections. A losing candidate will assume something happened. I call it the new political superstition that has arisen with the use of technology in elections. So elections, in countries like Rwanda, you're seeing elections as a system of mobilizing citizens towards a patriotic end. In countries like Kenya, you're seeing elections continuing to mobilize citizens along ethnic lines. So they are not contributing to social cohesion. They may be well run, but they are contributing to deeper social division, which is unraveling the national question.
Okay, now, from the 70s and the 80s, we had this dictatorial rule around Africa that people felt like the only kind of rule Africans had was dictators. But now elections have happened and people are saying that even in Rwanda, people feel like it's a dictatorial system, but we both know that the will of the people have been put into play. The elections happening and being successful, does that represent the will of the people in Africa?
I think the will of the people in Africa is often diverted, is often subverted by an international moral position. Orthodoxies like a liberal democracy must have multi-partyism. The following must happen for the will of the people to be legitimate. So if you simply assess the will of the people as to what is the aspiration of the citizenry in that country, both the urban and the rural, then you'd say, by and large, the will of the people is reflected in elections. But there's a second factor that you must look into. The will of the people, when they are divided along sectarian views, becomes counter the will and the interests of the nation, right? So it is important that in thinking about elections, we are ourselves not captivated by a Western neoliberal concept of the will of the people being atomic individualism that has been captured within what I call the ethnic contestation using the liberal democratic model, which is electioneering. So in my views, elections can serve a good purpose if they are linked to policy outcomes, if they are linked to issues and the broader national agenda. And the dictatorship is not the ability of a single individual to direct the nation. Dictatorship in the modern world is the ability of interests, especially shadowy interests, like funders who are in the diaspora, corporates that are or other states, like you saw what Russia did with the American election. That ability to substitute the will of the people, no matter how well intended, using money, using the invisible hand of global politics, is the new dictatorship. Because we're still stuck in the analysis of dictatorship premised on the old ways, where single cartels would run away with ballot papers, stuff ballot papers. Now you don't need people stuffing ballot boxes. Someone can literally, at the click of a button, substitute what the intention of the... So we must reimagine dictatorship in the current moment, and what it means and how it manifests itself.
Now, we know that for a long time in Africa, there was this title Nigerians ran with, the giant of Africa, the giant of Africa. But we know Nigerians had their own troubles in the last few months, few years, and the rest of it. In your opinion right now, what new African nation do you think can be called the new giant of Africa?
Nigeria still remains the giant of Africa.
Okay.
The fact that a giant has flew does not mean they've forfeited their giant status. The inelegancies of Nigerian leadership, the unpleasantness of the politics playing out, and even the threats to the power balance between the regions does not necessarily take away. Equally so, South Africa does not become any smaller because it has a fundamental ethical problem at the core of its leadership, and even suggesting that the state has been captured. In my sense that if you look at the giant status as modeling the link between leadership and results, then Rwanda must necessarily be placed on that stage. Of course, two things happen. Whatever questions people may raise with the Rwandan model, what you cannot question is the ability to deliver accountability to the citizenry, the ability to minimize corruption in the delivery of service, and also the capacity to build things that are visible and measurable for the common good. My sense is that Nigeria could get to that status, except one thing needs to happen, and that thing is that leadership needs to be decentralized truly, and people must see the possibility of leadership as cutting across the various sectors of Nigerian life. And Nigeria's own projection into the continent must go beyond the strength of the Nigerian military to hold petty dictators in the region to account, but must come to the strength and the willpower that Nigerians can exert on the rest of the continent in modeling how to do things differently. If Nigeria stemmed corruption, and Kenya and South Africa and Egypt, the rest of this continent would have very little place for the thieves who are running across borders to hide, whether it's narco traders, whether it's human traffickers, or people who are illicitly taking resources from the continent.
All right. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was great.
All right. Thank you.